Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I wanted to just make sure our press was aware. As early as this week, there will be a vote on a Congressional Review Act resolution. There will be a simple test for all U.S. senators. Who do you stand with? Do you stand with American workers who built this country, represented by this iconic photo here on the U.S. On the Empire State Building, or do you stand with the radical environmental elites represented by this individual? My Congressional Review Act resolution, co-sponsored by all 50 Republican senators, is simply going to rescind the new Biden NEPA rule promulgated in April, which clearly has the impact of slowing down the construction of infrastructure in America, energy projects, by the way, all energy projects, renewable, oil, gas, mining, roads, bridges, ports. It will slow down everything. So what's really important is here is who supports our Congressional Review Act resolution. Take a look at this list. We have over 50 supporters, and it is a broad-based, very diverse group of Americans who have one thing in common. They produce and build things in this country. Farmers, construction workers, an incredible group of building trade unions. Opposition, well, we've had a hard time trying to figure out who's against this resolution. We found the usual far-left radical environmental groups, and that's about it. So why do we have such broad-based support? 50 Republican senators, but more importantly, this group of Americans across the country. Why? I think we all know why. In America, we used to build things, big things that were the pride of every single American, on time, on budget. Think about it. Empire State Building, 440 days. Pentagon, 16 months. The 1,700-mile Alaska-Canada highway, 11 months. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, 800 miles across my great state, 3 years. Unbelievable, because we have the best workers in the world. But we don't build things anymore. We all know it. Every project in America, every infrastructure project in America gets caught up in red tape and litigation, usually sometimes taking decades just to permit a project. A couple examples. The Kensington Mine in Alaska, a gold mine that now employs hundreds of people, average wage about $110,000, took 20 years to permit with litigation. The Gross Reservoir in Colorado, 20 years to permit. And here's the thing. The people who are hurt the most by this crazy system of ours are working Americans, hard-working Americans. Just take a look at these two statements by Terry Sullivan, the head of LIUNA, the laborers, biggest construction union in America, and James Callahan, head of the operating engineers. They describe it perfectly. These two great Americans, hard-working Americans, leading union members, they know exactly what this permitting system is doing to their members. It's crushing their spirit and their jobs. So here's what we're saying. Enough is enough. Throughout my career in Alaska and here in D.C., when the National Democrats have a choice between the men and women who build this country and the far-left radical environmental groups, they always sell out working Americans. Always. I mentioned this in a Commerce Committee hearing recently. It upset one of my Senate Democratic friends. He said this wasn't true. So here's what I say. Okay, prove it. Here's your opportunity to prove it. With this vote, We'll see who you stand with. 50 Republican senators are going to stand with working Americans. We'll see if any Democratic senator joins us. Thanks again, and now for Senator Barrasso.
Well, I want to first thank and congratulate Senator Sullivan for bringing this issue to the forefront of the American people into the United States Senate. To get all 50 Republican senators signed on shows how uniform the support is for what Senator Sullivan is trying to accomplish and what we are all trying to accomplish. At home, and I was just home in Wyoming this weekend, people are hurting. We're at a 40-year high of inflation. 40-year high. They can't keep up. They're falling further and further behind. And what does this administration want to do? Saddle them with more red tape as we're trying to get things moving, trying to get back to construction. The administration claims, well, we passed this Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and they did, signed, worked together. Is any of that stuff ever going to get built? Any of it? Not with what the administration is trying to do with their new, they call it the NEPA Implementing Regulations Revisions. To me, it's not revisions. These are reversals. They're going to make it harder. I'm going to make it faster, better, cheaper, smarter ways to build things, to get construction done for projects. That's how you move forward an economy. That's why all of those groups have signed on, the whole list of different groups of representing working men and women, working communities. That's why people are here to say we need to have some relief from the environmental extremists who are running this administration. When NEPA was put into play years and years ago, it took less than a year on average to do an environmental impact statement. Now it takes an average of 6 years. There is something wrong. And what does Joe Manchin say about all of this? He's saying, well, he's signed on to this bill, this reckless tax and spending bill, because he's going to get a vote on something to make permitting easier later along the line. He ought to be doing that today. And I support what Senator Capito is talking about, is, hey, why doesn't he try to get that passed first before he goes and commits to this massive tax and spending bill? Democrats have repeatedly dragged their feet, making it harder to produce here in America, to construct here in America, under the guise of environmental movements which are controlling their party. I stand with Senator Sullivan and all of the Republicans and say it's time for the Democrats to join us to make it easier and smarter as we work to construct things to rebuild this country. Thank you, Jim.
Good morning. It's nice to be here. And I want to thank Senator Sullivan, too, for bringing this forward because this is absolutely perfectly timed as a test vote of the commitment that supposedly were given as to what kind of permitting reform or how serious that effort is. We find ourselves in a situation where, as Senator Barrasso said, we want to expand. We've got an IIJA that has all kinds of projects. We want that economic activity, and yet it's stalled. It's stalled because of the red tape of the NEPA process and other processes that are so burdensome on localities, on our private developers, on our state regulators. I mean, the list just goes on and on. So Senator Barrasso talked a little bit about the numbers, but in 2020, the White House's Office or Council on Environmental Quality found that average time to complete an environmental impact statement under NEPA was 4.5 years. 25% of those projects took more than 6 years to complete. Average time to complete a federal highway project, and I would say we have in that IIJA the one federal decision which is supposed to cap the amount of time that these environmental reviews are supposed to take, yet those are taking more than 7 years. Average time for the U.S. Corps of Engineers to complete an environmental impact statement, 6 years. Average length of a final environmental impact statement, 661 pages, and I'm sure those in Alaska and Wyoming and Ohio and West Virginia are much longer than that. So it's just basically unacceptable. The burdens are, the administration came in and rolled back some of the ease of permitting that the Trump administration had put in. I think it's important to make a distinction. This is not skirting any environmental laws. This is not overlooking any kind of environmental impacts that should be considered and that should be that we as environmentalists ourselves want to make sure are taking great care of in our states. These are just basically obstacles, whether they're legal or other obstacles that are put in the way that really prevent these projects from going forward. You know, it used to be Build Back Better. I guess that's not the name anymore. But I would say you can't build back better if you can't build. And that's what this administration is doing. So I think, you know, it's time for us to ask these questions. They're being put before us with this new bill that's come forward and been negotiated, that supposedly there's a deal to have regulatory reform put before. I've never seen anybody here that can actually guarantee a final vote. I mean, let's get real, especially on something this sensitive and so divisive at times as permitting reform. So yesterday I said, let's see the legislative text as to what they're going to do. Let's see how they vote on this initiative initiated by Senator Sullivan, because I think that is going to be the indicator of how serious they are to fulfill what they say is a promise that was made. Where's the trust factor here? Where is the commitment to the working men and women of this country who have great opportunities, great jobs connected with infrastructure development and the regulatory processes that hold them up from being able to provide for their families, cope with the high inflation that we see, and move forward to modernize our country? Thank you.
Well said, Shelley. So I want to start by thanking Senator Sullivan for his leadership on this and in permitting generally, because he has understood that America needs to be able to be competitive globally, and that the ability to green light a project in this country is harder than it is in almost all of our competitors, and we've fallen behind continually. About 11 years ago, I first got involved in this from a legislative perspective, and I've got the scars to show it. And it's always been bipartisan, but it's always been tough. And we were able to get the Fast 41, so-called, which was a provision in the last highway bill, which helped in terms of permitting. We were able to get the Permitting Council up and going. The Permitting Council looks at projects and speeds up the time frame. And as Senator Capito said so well, it's not about not having environmental reviews. It's being sure that the environmental reviews are done in a responsible way. And by the way, that's something the Trump administration added to with their NEPA rule, which said that you need to have reasonably foreseen environmental issues, which, you know, that's certainly reasonable. And then the Biden administration came in and pulled the rug out from under these projects all around the country. So clearly, this is a huge problem for our country. And again, we've made some progress here in Congress. But this NEPA rule that the Biden administration has put out is going exactly in the opposite direction. So finally, we were getting these projects green-lighted. We were helping in terms of the construction workers who are on that list of 50, who have been always supportive. The AFL-CIO Building Trades Council has been out front on this forever. Also, we worked with some environmental groups to come up, again, with this balanced approach. But now that balance has been shifted. So it's interesting because I first got involved in this because of a hydropower project, a green project. A hydropower plant on the Ohio River that was taking forever to get permitted. And the Metropolitan Utility Group came to me and said, gosh, can't you help us on our permitting? But this is true generally all around the country. This is affecting green energy projects as well as affecting highway projects. It's affecting wind farms. It's affecting solar farms. It's affecting the energy business generally. It's affecting what we just did in terms of providing all this funding for high-tech manufacturing in America. These same chip plants, the so-called fabs that make semiconductors, are going to be affected by this. So on the one hand, we're saying we want to encourage more projects in this country. We want to get ourselves in a situation where we're not losing ground to other countries around the world that have much better permitting rules. On the other hand, the Biden administration does this, which runs counter to everything that we've been promoting, again, on a bipartisan basis, not with many Democrats, but with enough to get it done. The final thing that I want to say is we are living in a time of really high inflation. For those of you in this room, you've never seen inflation like this. For those of us who have a few more gray hairs, we've seen it, but it's been 40 years. And people back home are just dying under the pressure of inflation. It's not just the price at the pump, it's food. It's their ability to buy clothes, it's their ability to pay their rent. I mean, everything is going up. This is going to add to inflation. Why? It's very simple. Inflation is about demand and supply being mismatched, right? And the supply is about things like projects, like a pipeline for natural gas to move it from the Marcellus and Utica fields in Ohio to the coast so that we can have liquefied natural gas. That's part of the supply side, is to be able to, as an example, to be able to have energy in this country, to be able to get the cost down. This actually runs counter to that. So it's wrong for so many reasons, but one is specifically right now, while we're trying so hard to figure out how do we get out of this inflationary spiral, we've got to do something, which the Fed is doing on the demand side, much better to do it on the supply side. And for us instead to be going the other way with this NEPA rule and to make it even harder, instead of taking 4 years, taking 6 years to permit some simple projects, including environmentally important projects to those on the other side, it just makes no sense whatsoever. So I appreciate the fact that we're going to have opportunity to speak on this, to vote on it. And I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle look at this carefully. And let's end up with reasonable permitting reforms. If we do that, we'll be able to move this country forward and be able to reduce the inflationary pressures we're feeling now.
Well, Rob, I'm glad when you talked about gray hairs, you looked over there instead of me and Shelley. I appreciate that.
Well, we won't get into that.
Are we going to be a country that builds things? We can be a country that builds things. One of the greatness of America is that we build things that nobody else can. I mean, we're renowned for it. I mean, people talk about America and our ability to build things. That's what this is all about. Because if we can't get permitted, we can't build things. So if we're going to have a NEPA process that takes 4 and 5 years, not only does that delay it, that means, sometimes delays defeat. That means we might never build it. Or if we do build it, what does it do to the cost? If you have to spend 5 years or longer trying to permit something, what does it do to the cost? Drives it up, doesn't it? So, again, it's like Ronald Reagan used to say, if you want less of something, tax it or regulate it. Well, that's exactly what's going on. We're making sure we're going to have less infrastructure, right? So here we are fighting inflation. And we're making it harder to produce the goods, the services, to bring the energy to market, the pipelines, the transmission lines, the roads, the bridges, all the things that will help alleviate these supply chain bottlenecks, all the things that will help us bring down inflation. The administration's doing just the opposite. They're making sure that they're raising taxes and increasing the regulation and spending more that just keeps driving inflation higher. And inflation's the cruelest tax of all. That's a tax that hits the low-income people the hardest. And they just keep doing it. They just keep doubling down on tax, spend, regulate. Tax, spend, regulate. And inflation just keeps going up. And we don't just have inflation now, we have stagflation. Senator Portman talked about a lot of you have never seen inflation this high that are younger, and that's true. But you've never seen stagflation because it's been over 40 years. And the administration has not only produced that stagflation, they're making it worse. And this is a great example. We've got a pipeline in North Dakota, Dakota Access Pipeline, moves more than 500,000 barrels of oil a day to markets around this country. The highest quality light sweet crude that we need at the pump so people aren't paying $5 a gallon and more. And we're not having to go to our adversaries like OPEC and others to get it. We produce it right here at home. That pipeline has been under a NEPA review for 5 years. For 5 years. And it's still in the NEPA process. And if they decide to shut it down, that's more than 500,000 barrels of our domestic crude that we're not going to have at the pump. Now, you tell me, will that help the price of gas at the pump? Will that make it lower or higher? Well, obviously, it'll make it higher. Right now, we're producing about 11.5 million barrels a day domestically. We were producing 13 million barrels a day. The president talks about letting oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Just shutting down these kind of projects will take far more of our domestic supply out of the market. At the same time, he's telling people that when they go fill their truck or their pickup truck or their car, at the pump he's trying to help them? I'd say not. I'd say the facts speak otherwise. And this is a clear example. And so I hope our colleagues will join with us in this CRA, Congressional Review Act, and knock down this regulation. Recognize that this regulation, whether it's an EIS, environmental impact statement, or an environmental assessment, it will take longer. Not maybe. Not maybe. It will take longer, it will cost more, and it will kill a lot of projects that we need right now.
Okay, any questions? Thanks, my colleagues.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah, Josh.
So you guys are talking a lot about the timeline element with NEPA.
Yeah.
The regulation that you're targeting, which is the phase 1 of NEPA reforms, is just dealing with, the main change there is saying that you should account for, agencies should account for direct, indirect effects.
Cumulative effects, yeah.
Meaning greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, it's more, no, but it's more, but it's,
Is the timeline piece. So they haven't actually done anything.
no, but it's actually more than that. And when you have the ability of agencies, there was a really good Wall Street Journal editorial today. We put it on your chair, so take a look at that. But there's nobody who's serious on these issues who doesn't agree that that NEPA reg that was promulgated in April is going to make it harder to do infrastructure and is going to make it longer timelines and more litigation. I mean, so the well, not climate, it's the focus on the impacts of the project itself. And what this regulation does is it takes that and it essentially explodes that on cumulative impacts almost anywhere as it relates to a project. It's kind of unending. And then you can have, and you will have, by those groups that I mentioned, who are opposed to my resolution, the ability for them to look at the reg and sue and gum this up even further. So what we are trying to do right now is say, this is actually remarkable. The president touts as one of his biggest achievements the bipartisan infrastructure bill that a number of us supported last fall. And then they come out with a NEPA rule that undoubtedly will make it harder to deploy the capital to build infrastructure. And that's why you're looking at over 50 groups across the country, as diverse as can be. But what I'm most proud of, look at all the labor unions that are focused on this. Those regs, they know it. Look what Terry O'Sullivan, look what Callahan say. They know those regs, including the April reg. This was the LIUNA statement on the April regs, saying don't do it. You're going to kill jobs. They did it. So what's remarkable about this is just how the White House is at war with itself. They say they want to build infrastructure, then they put out regs to make sure we won't build infrastructure. And that's why we need more than just Republicans to rescind this reg.
Just two thoughts quickly, because Dan mentioned infrastructure. He's absolutely right. And as you know, I helped negotiate that, as did others here, including Senator Capito, in a big way. And we insisted on having permitting reform be part of it. And what this will do is it will reverse the progress we had hoped to make on a number of things that actually helps in terms of the environment. Think of traffic congestion. So everyone will tell you there's more CO2 emissions when you have a traffic jam than when the traffic is running smoothly. And that's one reason, in the infrastructure bill, we're trying to encourage, more development of our travel infrastructure, transit infrastructure, including mass transit, including other things. That all takes longer now. Think about reforestation. One thing the infrastructure bill has is 1.2 billion new trees on the national forest, as an example. That's going to take longer. Some of the reforestation projects have to do with erosion and other things that require this NEPA review. Think about the environmental projects we had talked about earlier, not just solar and wind, but think about the infrastructure for electric cars. That's in that legislation, so $7.5 billion. That's going to take longer. So it actually runs counter to the infrastructure legislation that we just passed. And this is one thing that I feel was, in a way, pulling the rug out from under us after we had worked with the White House, worked with Democrats on both sides of the Capitol to come up with something that would help us to move forward on infrastructure. Finally, I will say it's not just the indirect costs, it's not just the cumulative costs, it's the upstream and downstream costs. And I think that's very difficult to analyze, and I think it gives regulators a huge opportunity to take their discretion and determine what, as an example, downstream costs might be. So if you have a natural gas pipeline running through my state of Ohio, or any of these pipelines these guys have talked about, by the way, it's relatively clean fossil fuel. It's needed right now. Everybody acknowledges that. And it goes across the stream. Under the old NEPA rules, you would look at the impact of that stream, and you should. And that was, reasonably foreseen was the way the Trump administration talked about it as an example. Now it's not just about that stream, or it's not just about that project in effect. It's about where is that pipeline going to go, and will it result in more fossil fuels being used, and therefore will it have an impact on the climate, and therefore should a regulator not approve that project? I think that's the issue in a nutshell as I can see it.
Can I add one thing here? The rule that they're talking about requires an evaluation of direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental impacts of the proposed action. Well, you want to talk about something that, could go on for a long period of time and create a lot of litigation. And then let's say you're going to be building a project and you have to evaluate all the direct, indirect, and cumulative aspects. That's pretty subjective. That's pretty hard to do. That's a pretty daunting task. And remember, we came out of a rule that the Trump administration put out where for an EIS, you had to get this done within a certain amount of time. 2 years for an EIS, 1 year for an EA. Okay, so there was a definitive amount of time that you had for this back and forth, and you created some regulatory certainty so that you could build the project. And one other point, so if we're talking about building a transmission line, is that renewable energy or is that traditional energy? It's both, right? So if you want electricity for all these different things, you need transmission, and that could be from a renewable project. It could be from a traditional type or a fossil type energy project, right? So again, as I think Rob finished up there, I think our colleagues should join with us on this because this really is about building things in this great country.
It seems like some of you are very skeptical of Senator Manchin's deal with permitting reform. I was wondering if you had plans to talk with him about his permitting plan, and could it be something that Republicans could support when it comes up?
Well, I'll start with that. I am skeptical of the deal, and I have talked with him, and I think a lot of us have talked with him. The sequencing of what they're proposing is, in my view, I wouldn't say it's suspicious. I said it leaves open many, many questions. So what he's saying is we're going to move forward with this tax and spending bill that we've all talked about, raising taxes, spending, which we think will harm in the inflation and harm the American people. We believe that to be true. But then in another 45 days, or before the end of September, I've been promised that we're going to pass permitting reform. He has a framework out there. I've said we need to see exact text because a framework really doesn't do you any good. The detail is what you need. And so I think we have skepticism because we've tried to work with our partners over on energy and our Democrat partners to try to get permitting reform and can't do it. I mean, I have a pipeline in his framework is the completion of a pipeline called the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is 95% complete. I've worked with him and the whole delegation to try to work any way we can through appropriations, through other bills, to try to help this pipeline get completed. What has happened is they've gotten the permit, and then exactly what Dan has said, the legal community comes out, and they end up in the circuit court, Fourth Circuit, and the Fourth Circuit has removed that permit twice under the parameters of this big and broad cumulative effects. And so you have investments of billions of dollars. You have a president who's telling other countries, we're going to bring you LNG, and yet his own administration won't let a 95% complete pipeline be completed. So I know that pipeline means a lot to Senator Manchin. It means a lot to me. But they've already disrupted it twice. Well, who's to say they won't disrupt it a third time and not give him his wish? So I just think I am very skeptical of what kind of deal can be cut on these kinds of very sensitive issues.
And I also think, I've looked at the framework. I talked to Senator Manchin just yesterday about these issues. But it kind of also comes back to the test that we're going to put forward here as early as this week. If you are serious about permitting reform, step one is to vote in favor of our resolution. Why wouldn't you do that? Every major group in America supports it with a very small exception. So show us your commitment on how serious you are with a yes vote on this CRA. I think I think these issues are actually connected.
I mean, isn't that kind of the direct common sense here? If you want to expedite the permitting process, vote with us here on this measure right now. This is something the Senate can actually do. You don't have to wait and count on somebody else. We get to vote on it. So let's take that step right now and reduce the regulatory burden. Furthermore, why would you agree to raise taxes, to increase spending at the time when we have inflation on some kind of promise that there might be some permitting reform when look at the kind of regulation that's being put out right now?
Any other? Yep.
Have any Democrats indicated support for the vote?
I've been in discussions with a number of Democrats, and including Senator Manchin. And I think that the fact that, again, just take a look at that list, it's very one-sided on the groups that support it, including all the building trades in America. So I know for a fact that they're kind of dreading this vote because it, as I mentioned, in my view, it's a simple vote. Who do you stand with? The men and women of America who build things, or the coastal elites who shut them down? So I've been trying to talk to a lot of my Democratic colleagues. None have made commitments either way, but I think the more support we're getting for this, and like I said, we're getting a lot. We'll give you guys the statements that all these groups are putting out. I think it's going to be a tough vote for them. They got to stand up and say, do they want infrastructure? Do they want to support the working men of America? Or do they want to stand with the far left coastal elites that don't want any of that? So it's going to be an important vote. But yeah, I'm trying to work with as many Democrat senators as possible to get them to yes on this important vote.
Thanks.
Right, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Can I get your thoughts on Speaker Pelosi going to Taiwan? You just put out a statement on that.
Yeah, I can. So you may have seen there, we put a statement out. It's, I think 26 senators put a statement out supporting the trip. And the reason we put that statement out is that this is something that we as elected officials do on a regular basis. And at the end of the day, you do not want the Chinese Communist Party dictating to senior American leaders where they can and cannot travel. So we are where we are on this. You know, you can do a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking of how it became such a contentious issue. My view, and I think the view of a number of senators, is that we should close ranks now and not let the Chinese Communist Party try to drive wedges between American elected officials or the White House on whether or not she should be there. She's there. We're supporting the trip, and we're closing ranks behind her. Thanks. And there's a lot of senators on that statement.
Do you have an amendment to the Sweden and Finland accession into NATO?
I do.
What is your amendment?
It's very simple. I think it should pass with a voice vote. We can get it to you. But it essentially says that the Senate believes that every member of NATO should commit to the 2% goal of GDP spending that was outlined in the 2014 Wales summit for NATO. Very simple. I think I'm hopeful we get a voice vote on it. I think it could pass that easily. So that's what my amendment is.
And do you have any indication that this will be voted on this week?
I think the goal is to have it voted on this week.